What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. We have arrived at a fairly diverse metagame. Now, this is largely because there are a lot of things that take a lot of different angles, and certain things in this metagame tend to be particularly vulnerable to specific tech answers. For example, Negative Star-Lord, a deck I think is one of, if not the best decks in the game, is particularly vulnerable to things like Mobius and Mobius for the negative game plans, removing the Magik for the games that require turn 7, and playing something like a Stardust in order to get rid of the line that involves the Arnim Zola onto a Star-Lord. All of these things are things that will happen to you. It's just not necessarily all of them are going to be in one deck. So this deck still maintains a very healthy presence at the top of the metagame, and last I checked was basically the most played deck at high levels of Infinite. That means that it is the #1 deck that you probably have to respect in this metagame. And respecting it looks like a lot of things, but really just playing for some angles is usually what you're gonna see. You're gonna see different decks when you go through this tier list. Some of them will have Merlin, some of them will have Mobius, some of them will have Stardust, almost none will have all three. And that is in deference to the fact that this is a pretty open metagame. A lot of these decks exist because you could hard target them, but it wouldn't be profitable to hard target just them, because that is what a diverse metagame means. Largely, Mr. Negative still gets to eat because of the fact that there are other viable decks. Interestingly, the base Alioth Legion version of the normal Star-Lord deck is one of the decks that has the best possible matchup into Mr. Negative. But because its own game plan is so undiverse, it's very all in on the Star-Lord thing, it tends to get countered more easily in exchange for that. Again, this is sort of in deference to the fact that, like, this deck can exist and can have a good matchup against the deck I have at the very first part of this video. But for example, let's say you autopilot it, you get Cosmic Ghost Rider out of a Doom 2099 deck. A Thanos deck plays a Stardust on you when you go for a destroying your own Star-Lord in order to spawn 2 more. There are just so many decks that have small tools to deal with you that it makes this deck's cube equity go significantly downward. Very few people are going to be staying into your obvious wins, but there are a lot of built-in solid plays in a deck like this. There is nothing to sneeze at when it comes to the output here. And the more people start playing things that are just like in the big boy realm of decks, the more people are like involved in the big boy arms race, Doom 2099, Ramp, the Ensabanur Jubilee decks. Those kinds of things don't have nearly the ability to play interactive things like Cosmic Ghost Rider as some of the other lists in this conversation do. Doom 2099 can, Ramp can, all the Ensabanur stuff basically can't. And the more people that it siphons off from those first two, the better off this deck is going to be, because it goes over the top of those decks without actually getting interacted with. And that is largely the premise of both Star-Lord decks. If you're not being interacted with, you're going over the top of basically anything. I've become a Lee Hand enjoyer, but it's not necessarily about Lee Hand per se. It's about the combination of Gambit and Mobius, allowing you coverage against decks that try to go under you, i.e. scalers like Batroc and Craven and things of that nature, and also decks that try to go over you, things like Mr. Negative, Living Tribunal. It's not perfect coverage, but they are complementary in really meaningful ways, and typically when Victoria Hand gets cards like this that are complementary in those meaningful ways. I think a good example would be when it had the ability to play Shadow King and Deafening Chord, when both of those cards were incredibly relevant into the metagame in different but overlapping and also wide covering ways. That is the kind of thing that allows Victoria Hand to actually shine, and I do think that the introduction of Gambit into her archetype has done what it needed to do to drag her back from the depths of relative irrelevancy in a world where Shou-Lao was so dominant against other mid-range decks. It's easy to look at this metagame and say that the things that matter are Star-Lord, Gambit, Shou-Lao, and then big guys, and I think that that's a fairly accurate description. I just think that this is also the best best version of the Gambit decks at dealing with all the other stuff that you're going to see. The dynamism here is very, very notable. You could choose to go wide with Victoria Hand copies, tall with copies of Lin-Li, or extra disruptive with copies of Gambit. Which one you choose allows you to customize your game plan to what you're actually seeing. Again, no deck in Marvel Snap is perfect, but this is as close as Victoria Hand has felt to being one of the best decks in the game in a very long time. Part of why I prefer this version over the stock version, which you see on screen right now, is that it has the ability to go taller with a Lin-Li, and it doesn't require the additional 4-drop of Misery in order to do that, which allows it to get something like a Mobius in here, although you could swap out Red Guardian for Mobius. Again, you're looking for coverage and things of that nature. I think that largely the thing that I like the most about the previous list compared to this one is that it gets to choose, right? When you play the Hood, you're not going to not do that. But if you then don't draw the Misery, that can be the kind of thing that really loses you games. You get to opt into the Lin-Li stuff. And when it's not good, you don't have to play it. But there's no world in which you're not going to play the Hood in a deck like this. And I think that like the forcedness of the choice in a list like this is notable, and the fact that the Lin-Li stuff can actually go a little bit taller is another reason why I give the edge to the other version of this list. Okay, so we talked about 2 versions of Gambit, 2 versions of Star-Lord. Now let's talk about 2 versions of Shou-Lao before we talk about 5 versions of big boy decks. First up, the base Shou-Lao list. The change to Mysterio has put Luke Cage in this list, and now it gets to play basically all payoffs. If you have a Luke Cage and Mysterio, that's basically the same as having something like a Scarlet Spider. You are all payoffs here, although it is notable that you are going to have to ration your 1 costs because Merlin is such a powerful thing in terms of allowing you to always have access to 2 cards a turn, and without him, you can end up in a little bit of an awkward situation. I also think it would be viable to take out one of the disruptive or bonus kinds of cards, that is to say, America Chavez, Spider-Ham, or Iceman, in order to get a Kitty Pryde in here, just to make sure that you are more consistently activating your game plan with Shou-Lao. This is, of course, an all-in Shou-Lao list, so if you don't draw Shou-Lao, you're kind of in a lot of trouble. I got this list from Unhelpful Yoda, who's been playing it a lot near the top 10. I think it's a very solid take on what the archetype is and can be, and it modifies all, and the fact that you have so many payoffs means that really it is just draw Shou-Lao and you'll be doing something pretty stupid. That's a realistic and viable approach to how this metagame has shaped up. It also just likes having good cards, and there's something to be said for that too. This is a deck that has a lot of fairly compelling cards in them. There's some meaningful disruption, and certain decks are really going to hurt when you do something meaningful like Iceman, they're Doom 2099, or Iceman, they're Mr. Negative, or Spider-Ham, either one of those cards. Like, it's a deck that gets a lot of additional equity from the random free wins it gets from those cards as well. From Honifer, the Showcasta list now also includes Merlin, largely out of deference to the Mr. Negatives that are running around playing Magic with impunity. Shou-Lao is typically a deck that cannot meaningfully beat things that are doing Magic things on you. Like, if you're playing against anything playing Magic, Zombie Galacti, or Mr. Negative, or like legitimately anything, and you're not playing the Merlin in your deck, you are almost certainly going to lose because they are going to do better things with that final turn than you are. Part of what makes Shou-Lao so dangerous in a normal game of Marvel Snap is how tightly optimized he is to maximize point output on turn 6, but that strength becomes a weakness when there is a turn 7 because he is simply not built for that. That's a real thing, but it does mean that you are sort of on, I need to get rid of Magic every time you play one of these games. Now, this is also a deck that has a lot of additional upside in a form of the Activate package. The Activate package is really, really interesting here in large part because it can be vulnerable to Gambit duplications in really powerful and bad ways for you, but it also provides perhaps the most over-the-top combo-centric version of Shou-Lao that we've been able to play recently, and that is a valuable position to take. Largely, what Shou-Lao has done in metagames like this is say, I am the mid-range deck that is bigger than the other mid-range decks. And sometimes I am also able to fit in meaningful disruption for combo decks. Things like Merlin, so I can blow up a Limbo. Things like Spider-Ham, so I can blow up a key card. That split of things is what allows this deck to continually succeed. It has more points in its combo endgame than a typical mid-range deck, and also a bit of meaningful disruption for the combos. That is the fundamental case being made here. Almost the entire rest of the metagame is just people trying to figure out ways to be big. Doom 2099 is one of the most baseline things in this metagame. You'll see a pretty shocking amount of this list. It's a very reasonable, solid, easy to play list that has some pretty pronounced weaknesses and some pretty pronounced strengths. The strengths, obviously, are that it does points immensely well, and it gets to play 2 legitimately powerful 5-drops that can interact in really notably good ways against some of the better decks in this metagame. If you run into something like an Invisible Woman First Steps combo deck, well, there is no card better against that than a Cosmic Ghost Rider. You run into Shou-Lao, you have Sandman for that. This is a deck that is able to do a lot of baseline powerful stuff and have enough interaction in it that its theoretical losing matchups are not necessarily such a losing proposition anymore. Its weakness is the same as it's always been. A good player spends a lot of the final turn just mathing out what your play is going to be. Oh, you're going to play an Aurora or a Doctor Doom. I am going to figure out if I can beat that. If I cannot beat that, I will leave. It's a very face-up deck once you really get down to it, and that is a negative cube profile to have, but frankly, I think that's really only going to matter when you get really high up. This is definitely a recommended list. The other Moondragon version of a Chamber deck is, of course, Ramp. Moondragon Chamber, almost a deck-building archetype unto itself at this point, perhaps the #1 harbinger of your opponent is about to play some big boys and probably try to cheat them into play. Luckily for you, Ramp is the fairest of these decks, the least cheaty. Unluckily for you, even if it's not cheating, it's doing some pretty ridiculous stuff, and it also has a complement of interactive 5-drops that can really get people. Legion, in this case, is particularly good against Magic decks like Mr. Negative, and Cosmic Ghost Rider has wide applications across the entire metagame. Those are your cube juicers in a list like this, and the rest of the list is fairly coherent and strong point output. You play a 2-drop, you play a Rampy 3, you blink that Rampy 3, you play a 6, you play a 7. That is the game. And that is totally acceptable to win. When you need to interact, well, you have a couple of interactive 5s that have reasonable bodies on them, and that's just enough to be a good deck. Okay, so we basically covered what I would consider the known areas of the metagame. 2 Star-Lord decks, 2 Shou-Lao decks, 2 Gambit decks, 2 Chamber and Moondragon decks. Let's get into how other decks and top deck builders are looking to fit themselves and what they're trying to do into that metagame. An example would be this list from Ika. This is a powerful scam Mobius list that I personally believe falls a little bit short once I got the Mobius and Gambit into the V-Hand package. Once that happened, I felt like I had a lot less of a reason to play a list like this, because this list is doing a lot of the similar things that list is doing, but it's introducing a sort of high risk, high reward upside strategy that I'm not necessarily convinced is necessary to be a good deck in this metagame. It definitely adds a lot of upside potential when you're doing ridiculous Pixie Fin Fang Foom stuff, but it also adds a ton of downside potential because you can really brick with a list like this. Generally, when I look at a list like this, I think, what is the cause for me to play it? And last week, the cause for me to play a list like this was that I get to be a Mobius deck. But now that Mobius has sort of made his way into the V-Hand list, I less feel like this is the only place that I can get it. And that's an unfortunate realization because this is a really fun list, but I do think that it's giving up too much in terms of consistency when compared to the V-Hand stuff that is much more stripped down and built to work like a well-oiled machine. This is, I don't know, it's if that's like a very reliable car, this is like a car that breaks down all the time. But it's really cool. I've seen a lot of interesting stuff in the Thanos space, and Thanos remains one of the few lists that can meaningfully play like a Mobius and some other interactive tech. Like when you look at a list like this, you see Mobius, Red Guardian. You also could even, if you really want to stretch it, count something like Thing First Steps as interactive tech. If you wanted to cut the Ensabanur for a Stardust, like there are very few decks that are able to get all of those cards in there and still output points. Thanos is able to do that because it cheats, right? Like Thanos is able to play all those cards because it is a Thanos list and thus is not necessarily beholden to like, oh, you know, my 9 power card isn't going to be free, right? Like it gets to just get a free Mockingbird a lot of the time, and that facilitates its ability to play a lot of tech cards. I do think there's a lot to be said for Thanos in a metagame like this. It's like a solidly tier 2 list, but it is significantly powerful. A card I really want to highlight is Iska. Iska is a card that is just Aurora staple. Like I know everyone thought that, you know, when she came out, it's invisible when first steps Iska, and you can play her like that. That's not a bad deck. But I really do think that her Aurora interaction of just being like, you know, you play her, she doubles. She's like the second best 4 to play in any Aurora deck, and Thanos can't play the first best 4, which is probably Doom 2099. Iska's really impressed me in the sense of like you give her kind of any buff while you're doing other things, and she's like a real threat to win lanes. I don't exactly know how I feel about Supergiant right now, because on the one hand, I feel like it's a pretty good deck that typically has close games against a lot of other really good decks. But I don't know if I feel like it's actually meaningfully favored in a lot of those matchups. It's very much a deck that, like, if you're a good player, you're playing it, you're going to outskill people who maybe are less familiar with the matchup than you. But it does strike me as a deck that, like, there's nothing easy in this list. This list has 0 free wins in it, and if you're playing a ladder deck, I think a lot of the time you actually should care about how many wins are going to be free, especially over like something as long as a season, or if you're someone who's like coming into the game, you're like making a commitment to a deck for an extended period of time. You're committing to something that is like meaningfully difficult, and I do think that this deck has a bunch of tools. I am still on the exact W version, and it is a really strong deck. There are really good things to be done here, but it is going to be difficult. There are limited amounts of points in this list, and you are really going to need to put some respect on them. One thing that I've seriously started considering is like, I got to get a Scarlet Witch in here. I got to get a Nocturne in here, because the card Magik is just unbelievable against you. The other Supergiant list is, of course, perhaps one of the biggest casualties of Gambit. That is the Craven Batroc Shell. This list does a lot of like things that I would want to do in the Supergiant list, right? Like it fixes a lot of the problems you have. You have like a much more over the top ability to like scale and have real points and really compete with what other people are doing. You disrupt them with your Supergiant package, and it's really good. You really lose to Gambit. Like you can kind of beat one Gambit, maybe some of the time, but you're not going to feel good about it. If they Gambit Frigga, if they Moon Girl Gambit, you are not capable of handling that. You just simply do nothing about it. And that is unfortunately one of the realities of this deck, which is not to say like it's bad. I think that like basically every other matchup it has is actually a little bit better than the normal Supergiant deck. But you cannot beat the Gambit decks, and that is something that matters. I still see a lot of people playing the old versions of the Hela list with Star-Lord in it. And those versions are the ones with like Crystal and Howard the Duck, and I really want those people to know you don't have to do that anymore. There's like an actual better version of the list. I had it on the tier list last week. I still see a ton of people playing the normal one. I strongly advise you go this direction. A lot of the same upside is included. You have a ton of amounts of power output, and you even have the ability to do Fin Fang Foom Juggernaut, just like the real Star-Lord lists do in the worlds where you aren't drawing your Hela, you aren't drawing your MODOK, you aren't drawing your Blink, or they play a Stardust. Stardust is the biggest counter here. Like, there is sort of a fundamental cap on how good a deck like this can be because of Stardust, but just having an actionable plan plan into what people are going to be snapping you on is so meaningful. I think that the Hela Star-Lord lists are actually legitimately good decks, and I think that this one is significantly better. Arishem is just around. A lot of why it's around is down to what Gambit can do for it. Gambit, of course, is a pillar of this metagame, one of the 3 or 4 pillars, depending on if you think Big Boy Deck is a pillar of the metagame. But what Gambit does for this list fundamentally is make it so that you can just be strong at dealing with the things that are typically bad for you. And that doesn't even mean like things that exist right now, because a lot of what Gambit has done is chased away the things that beat you. Arishem decks hate seeing things like scalers early in the game. They hate seeing decks like Shou-Lao stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking. They're not built for that. Gambit is amazing, and he is built for that. And he really gives these decks some meaningful upgrades. Arishem's a deck I've seen a lot more of. It definitely falls in the big boys category. My best advice for playing against this list is like, unless they're really telegraphing something, and I mean really telegraphing it, a lot of the time you shouldn't necessarily respect a play around unless it comes with a snap. That's basically what I read on these lists. Like, when they're snapping, there's usually a reason for it. Like, they're like, oh, I've locked it up, I've drawn my Alioth, I've got my Lady Deathstrike, I've got my, sometimes they play a Cosmic Ghost Rider, you know, things like that that are like really good against specific things. Other than that, I think that it's typically best to just be like, it's fine. They probably don't have it. They have 24 cards in their deck or more. If they're on like Kang or Thanos, you're usually just like able to say that it's pretty reasonable. When they're snapping, there is almost always an extremely coherent reason why. And that is usually going to be based on what deck you're playing. This section could probably be like 5 decks. There's a bunch of people just doing Ensabanur things. Like, it's hard to actually describe what individually each of them are, but there are people doing like, here's my Ensabanur deck with all big guys, and I'm playing like I'm using the skill that pulls a guy, Astral Projection, in order to get extra copies of Dragon Lord and Jubilee and Arnim Zola, and I'm just doing all of that. I saw Roram doing that. Again, like, it's fine, but they're all kind of basically the same deck, which is, here are some very large men. Please don't go over the top of or interact with my very large men. What these decks get to do that is actively good is not be vulnerable to Mobius. And that is a good thing. Like, you've noticed Mobius popping up more in this tier list. These decks are like, well, what if I played a deck that just didn't care about that at all? Totally valid thing to do. Same principle behind like the Star-Lord Hela decks or even the base Star-Lord decks, where it's like, yeah, I'm more predictable and there's definitely things I lose to, but if my opponents aren't playing those things and they are instead playing things aimed at energy cheat, well, then I'm probably doing all right, aren't I? And this is, I think, probably one of the more restrained versions of the Ensabanur stuff. You'll see some wild stuff in this space. None of it feels bigger than tier 2. All of it loses to Stardust. It's all just points cheating, but Marvel Snap is still the game you can win by cheating points. You can still do that. Honestly, this is one of the most open I've ever seen a metagame be. The trifecta at the top is there, and the fact that it's so dynamic is what allows the rest of the metagame to be as open as it is. Because, like, yes, okay, we have Mr. Negative, he's at the top, Negative Star-Lord, but then suddenly the Gambit decks are adapting to Negative Star-Lord by putting Mobius in the deck, and then it's suddenly not nearly as free, and the Gambit decks, being Gambit decks, are pretty solid into the Shou-Lao decks, but when they're playing Mobius, Mobius is a useless card in that matchup, so you're kind of playing a worse deck into the Shou-Lao decks, which means that the Shou-Lao decks are now able to go over the top of you, maybe with their Activate core. Maybe they disrupt you with an Iceman and a Spider-Ham and all of that thing. That interplay between those 3 archetypes creates a lot of space for a bunch of other stuff. What's interesting is I think a lot of the other stuff in this metagame is just like, let me cheat a guy who's got like 16 power onto the board. Like, it's actually quite interesting. There's a lot of like okay, I'm going to end Sabanur or my Jubilee. There's a lot of I'm going to play an Electro ramp deck. There's a lot of I'm going to play a Doom 2099 deck. And like, it's almost like a second metagame triangle forms there, where it's just like a bunch of people doing the biggest numbers they can that don't involve cheating energy. It's a very interesting dynamic that's happened in this metagame. And I think it's a pretty compelling one. There's a ton to be done in this metagame. I rarely finish a tier list and think I could probably have put 5 more decks on here. This is one of those situations. There's the triangle at the top of the metagame, the sub-triangle of the big guy decks, and then just fitting into that. A ton of decks are viable right now. A lot of things you can climb with. So best of luck on the ladder. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.